The autumn of 1848 brought with it an unprecedented wave of political unrest across the Austrian Empire, as revolutionary fervor swept through cities and countryside alike, challenging the ancient order that had governed Central Europe for centuries. Along the treacherous mountain passes between Vienna and Prague, where medieval castles stood sentinel over valleys shrouded in morning mist, danger lurked behind every bend in roads that had once been considered the safest in the empire. Lady Ophelia Ashford pressed herself against the velvet cushions of her family's ornate carriage, her emerald eyes wide with terror as the sounds of approaching hoofbeats grew steadily louder. Through the small window, she could see nothing but the dense forest that lined both sides of the narrow mountain road, its ancient trees creating shadows that seemed to conceal 1,000 threats. "Fie, lady," whispered her elderly maid Margaret, clutching her prayer book with white-knuckled fingers. "Perhaps we should have waited for the military escort as your father advised." Ophelia's jaw tightened with familiar frustration. At 24, she had grown weary of being treated like a fragile ornament requiring constant protection. The urgent summons from her cousin in Prague, word that her beloved aunt was dying and asking for her, had seemed to justify the risk of traveling with only a small guard contingent rather than the full military protection her father had insisted upon. "Aunt Helena may not have time for us to await proper escorts," Ophelia replied firmly, though her voice betrayed the anxiety she was trying to suppress. "Some risks are worth taking for the people we love." The carriage driver's shout of alarm cut through their conversation like a blade. "Bandits ahead, my lady!" A full company blocking the road. Through the window, Ophelia could now see them clearly. At least 20 mounted men wearing the rough clothing of peasants, but carrying weapons that spoke of military training. Their leader, a scarred brute with cold eyes, sat his horse with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence and intimidation. "Lady Ashford," the bandit leader called out in heavily accented German, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air, "your reputation for beauty precedes you. Step out of your carriage, and perhaps we can discuss terms for your safe passage." The crude laughter of his companions left no doubt about what sort of terms he had in mind. Ophelia felt cold fear settle in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would serve no purpose now. Her guard contingent, 6 men who had served her family faithfully for years, formed a protective circle around the carriage, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Captain Morrison, her father's most trusted soldier, approached the carriage window with obvious reluctance. "My lady," he said quietly, "I fear we are in grave difficulty. These are not common brigands. They move like trained soldiers and are too well organized for a casual highway robbery. I suspect they have been specifically hunting for your carriage." The implications of his words sent ice through Ophelia's veins. If this was a targeted attack rather than random banditry, it meant someone with detailed knowledge of her travel plans had arranged this ambush. But who would wish her harm and why? "What are our options, Captain?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Few and poor," Morrison admitted grimly. "We can attempt to fight our way through, but against such odds, or we can surrender and hope they honor whatever agreements they might make." Ophelia looked at the faces of her loyal guards, good men with families who depended on them, soldiers who had sworn to protect her even at the cost of their own lives. The thought of leading them into hopeless battle for her sake was unbearable. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "if I were to speak with their leader directly—" "Absolutely not," Morrison interrupted with unusual firmness. "My lady, you cannot know what such men might do. Your safety is my responsibility, and I will not permit you to place yourself at their mercy." But even as they spoke, the bandits were growing impatient. Their leader spurred his horse closer to the carriage, his hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. "Lady Ashford," he called again, his tone growing more menacing, "my patience has limits. You will emerge now or we will drag you out. The choice is yours, but the outcome is inevitable." Ophelia closed her eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer for courage and wisdom. When she opened them again, her mind was made up. Better to face whatever fate awaited with dignity than to cower in false safety while good men died for her pride. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "you and your men will stand down. I will not have blood spilled in a hopeless cause." "My lady, I cannot—" "You can and you will," Ophelia interrupted with the authority she had inherited from generations of aristocratic ancestors. "That is a direct order." Morrison's face was a mask of anguish, but military discipline won out over personal feelings. He stepped back with a reluctant bow, signaling his men to lower their weapons. Ophelia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to step out of the carriage to face whatever awaited her. But as her hand reached for the door handle, the sound of a single horse approaching at breakneck speed echoed through the forest. Through the trees burst a rider, whose appearance was so unexpected that both bandits and guards stared in momentary confusion. He was clearly a gentleman of the highest rank, dressed in an immaculate blue uniform with gold braiding that marked him as a member of the Imperial Guard. His mount was a magnificent black stallion that moved with the precision of a highly trained warhorse, and at his side hung a cavalry sword whose craftsmanship spoke of royal patronage. But what was most remarkable about the newcomer was not his obvious nobility or military bearing. It was the complete absence of fear on his face as he surveyed a situation that should have sent any rational person fleeing for help. Instead, he reined in his horse with casual grace and addressed the bandit leader as if encountering armed brigands was merely a minor inconvenience in his day. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said in perfect, unaccented German, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Vienna's finest drawing rooms. "I trust I am not interrupting anything important?" The bandit leader's confusion quickly gave way to amusement at what he clearly saw as either remarkable bravery or complete insanity. "And who might you be, fine sir, to ride alone into such a situation?" The stranger's smile was both charming and utterly dangerous. "Prince Maximilian von Habsburg," he replied with a slight bow from the saddle. "And you, I believe, are about to make what will prove to be a very serious error in judgment." The name sent shockwaves through both sides of the confrontation. Prince Maximilian was legend throughout the empire, a younger son of the imperial family who had earned his reputation through military brilliance, diplomatic skill, and a personal courage that bordered on the reckless. He was also known to be traveling somewhere in this region on a secret mission for the emperor, though the exact nature of his business remained shrouded in mystery. "Your Highness," the bandit leader said with mock respect, though uncertainty now colored his voice, "surely you do not mean to interfere with our business transaction with the lady?" Maximilian's expression grew colder, and his hand moved with deceptive casualness to rest on his sword hilt. "I mean to do considerably more than interfere. I mean to end it. The question is whether you gentlemen prefer to depart vertically or horizontally." The threat was delivered with such perfect politeness that it took a moment for its full implications to sink in. When they did, nervous laughter rippled through the bandit ranks, though several of the more experienced fighters began to shift uncomfortably in their saddles. From her position in the carriage, Ophelia watched this extraordinary scene unfold with fascination and terror in equal measure. Prince Maximilian was undoubtedly the most handsome man she had ever seen, with features that belonged in a Renaissance painting and bearing that spoke of generations of royal breeding. But more than his physical perfection, it was his absolute confidence in the face of impossible odds that took her breath away. He was one man facing 20 armed brigands, and he seemed genuinely unconcerned by the disparity in numbers. "For your Highness," the bandit leader said, his earlier amusement giving way to calculation, "perhaps we can reach an accommodation. There is no need for unnecessary bloodshed when a simple payment could resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction." Maximilian's laugh was musical and utterly without humor. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the nature of our negotiation. You see, I have already decided how this encounter will end. The only variable is how much unpleasantness will be required to achieve that outcome." The tension in the mountain pass had reached a breaking point, with 20 armed bandits facing a single prince whose confidence seemed either divinely inspired or completely mad. Prince Maximilian sat his magnificent stallion with the ease of a man born to command, his blue-gray eyes assessing the tactical situation with the cool calculation of a seasoned military strategist. "Gentlemen," Maximilian continued, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp autumn air, "I will give you one opportunity to withdraw gracefully. Abandon this foolish enterprise, release Lady Ashford and her party unharmed, and I will allow you to depart with your lives intact." The bandit leader's face darkened with rage at what he perceived as arrogant mockery. "Your Highness seems to have difficulty with mathematics. Perhaps royal education does not include basic counting." "My education," Maximilian replied with a smile that sent chills through more than one of the watching brigands, "included considerably more practical subjects than you might imagine. Shall I provide you with a demonstration?" Without waiting for a response, the prince spurred his horse forward in a movement so sudden and fluid that it caught everyone off guard. His sword cleared its scabbard in a motion that was pure liquid steel, and before the nearest bandit could react, Maximilian's blade had traced a perfect arc that severed the man's sword belt and sent his weapon tumbling to the ground. The prince wheeled his mount with expert precision, positioning himself between the bandits and Ophelia's carriage, while never taking his eyes off the enemy leader. The entire maneuver had taken perhaps 5 seconds and demonstrated a level of horsemanship and swordsmanship that spoke of years of intensive training. As I was saying, Maximilian continued conversationally, as if he had not just disarmed a man while traveling at full gallop, my education was quite comprehensive. Now, shall we discuss your departure, or would you prefer additional demonstrations? From her position in the carriage, Ophelia found herself mesmerized by the prince's display of controlled violence and absolute self-assurance. She had attended countless court functions and met dozens of noble warriors, but none had ever exhibited such casual mastery of deadly skills combined with perfect aristocratic manners. The disarmed bandit scrambled to retrieve his weapon, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. "You arrogant royal bastard! Let's see how well you fight when the odds are more even." He gestured sharply to his companions, and suddenly the air filled with the ring of steel as 20 swords cleared their scabbards simultaneously. The bandits began to spread out in a coordinated pattern, clearly designed to surround and overwhelm their single opponent through sheer weight of numbers. Maximilian observed their deployment with the detached interest of a chess master studying an opponent's opening gambit. "Interesting formation," he noted approvingly. "Someone has given you actual military training. This should prove more entertaining than I initially anticipated." Captain Morrison, watching from his position near the carriage, felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Prince Maximilian's reputation for personal courage was legendary, but no man, regardless of skill or training, could hope to survive against such overwhelming odds. The mathematics of combat were inexorable. 20 against 1 meant certain death, no matter how talented the individual fighter might be. "Your Highness," Morrison called out desperately, "perhaps we should attempt a fighting withdrawal. My men and I can cover your retreat." "Retreat?" Maximilian's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Captain, I fear you misunderstand the situation entirely. I am not here to retreat. I am here to rescue a lady and punish brigands who have forgotten their proper place in the social order." The prince's tone was so matter-of-fact, so completely devoid of bravado or false heroics, that it took everyone a moment to process what he had actually said. He genuinely intended to fight 20 trained killers single-handedly, and he seemed to view the outcome as a foregone conclusion in his favor. "Your Highness," Ophelia called from the carriage, her voice carrying clearly despite her attempt to remain unnoticed. "Surely wisdom suggests avoiding unnecessary bloodshed when other options remain available." Maximilian turned toward her voice, and for the first time since his arrival, his expression softened slightly. "My lady, your concern for my welfare is both touching and unnecessary. I assure you this situation is well within my capabilities to resolve." The brief exchange allowed Ophelia her first clear view of the prince's face, and what she saw there took her breath away. This was not the expression of a reckless fool driven by pride or masculine posturing. Instead, she recognized the calm confidence of a professional soldier who had assessed a tactical situation and found it manageable rather than impossible. Prince Maximilian von Habsburg, she realized with a mixture of awe and terror, actually believed he could defeat 20 armed men in single combat. More disturbing still, his absolute certainty was beginning to convince her that he might actually be correct. The bandit leader, growing increasingly frustrated with the prince's apparent immunity to intimidation, decided that action would succeed where threats had failed. "Enough talk. Take him down. The man who brings me the royal bastard's head will share equally in whatever ransom the lady brings." The promise of increased reward galvanized the brigands, and they began to close their circle with deadly purpose. Steel glinted in the dappled sunlight as 20 experienced fighters prepared to overwhelm their single opponent through coordinated assault. Maximilian drew himself up in his saddle, and suddenly his entire bearing changed from aristocratic gentleman to imperial war prince. The transformation was so dramatic that several of the approaching bandits actually hesitated, sensing that they were no longer facing a mere courtier, but something far more dangerous. "Gentlemen," the prince said, his voice now carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding armies, "you have chosen your path. I trust you will not object if I choose mine." What happened next would be talked about in taverns and drawing rooms across the empire for decades to come. Prince Maximilian spurred his stallion forward with explosive force, but instead of attempting to break through the encircling bandits, he rode directly toward the densest part of their formation. His sword became a silver blur of motion, deflecting strikes while simultaneously delivering precise counterattacks that dropped two men before they could fully comprehend what was happening. The prince's tactical genius became immediately apparent. Rather than allowing himself to be surrounded and overwhelmed, he was using mobility and superior skill to fragment the bandits' coordinated assault. His horse, clearly trained for combat, wheeled and pivoted with mechanical precision, keeping its rider in constant motion while positioning him for optimal advantage against multiple opponents. Impossible, Captain Morrison breathed, watching as the prince's blade traced a deadly pattern through the melee. No one fights like that, no one. But even more remarkable than Maximilian's swordsmanship was his apparent ability to track multiple opponents simultaneously. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of every threat, deflecting attacks from behind while pressing forward against enemies to his front, maintaining perfect balance despite the chaos surrounding him. 3 more bandits fell in rapid succession, their weapons no match for the prince's superior training and equipment. The formation that had seemed so threatening moments earlier was already beginning to disintegrate as individual fighters found themselves isolated and outmatched. From her carriage window, Ophelia watched the impossible battle unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing admiration. Prince Maximilian was not simply winning through superior skill, he was conducting the entire engagement like a deadly symphony, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, each strike precisely calculated for maximum effect. But even as the prince's dominance became apparent, Ophelia noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The bandit leader had not joined the initial assault. Instead, he was circling around behind the carriage, his eyes fixed not on the spectacular combat, but on her specifically. "Margaret," she whispered urgently to her maid, "that man is trying to reach us while the prince is distracted." The elderly woman followed Ophelia's gaze and immediately understood the implications. "My lady, perhaps we should attempt to flee on foot and abandon Prince Maximilian to face even greater odds." Ophelia's voice was firm with decision. "Never, but we must warn him of the danger." Before Margaret could protest, Ophelia threw open the carriage door and stepped into the morning air, her emerald silk dress brilliant against the forest backdrop. Her appearance immediately drew attention from several combatants, but more importantly, it allowed her to see the tactical situation clearly for the first time. The prince was indeed winning his impossible battle, but the effort was beginning to tell. His movements remained precise and deadly, but she could see the slight tremor in his sword arm that spoke of growing fatigue. Meanwhile, the bandit leader was indeed flanking around toward the carriage, clearly intending to seize her as a hostage, to force the prince's surrender. "Your Highness," Ophelia called out, her voice cutting through the clash of steel. "Behind you, their leader approaches the carriage." Maximilian's head snapped around at her warning, his eyes immediately assessing the new threat. For just an instant, his attention was divided between the enemies before him and the danger to Ophelia, and in that moment of distraction, one of the remaining bandits managed to land a glancing blow that drew blood from the prince's left shoulder. The sight of royal blood seemed to energize the surviving brigands, and they pressed their attack with renewed fury. Simultaneously, the bandit leader spurred his horse toward Ophelia's position, his scarred face twisted with triumph as he realized that victory might still be within reach. The climactic moment of the battle had arrived, and everything would depend on whether Prince Maximilian could protect both himself and the woman he had sworn to rescue. The sight of blood on Prince Maximilian's shoulder sent a surge of fury through Ophelia that surprised her with its intensity. This brave, magnificent man was bleeding because he had risked everything to protect her, and now the cowardly bandit leader was attempting to use her as leverage to defeat him. "My lady, get back in the carriage," Captain Morrison shouted, but Ophelia ignored him completely. Instead, she did something that would have scandalized every drawing room in Vienna. She reached into the carriage and seized the pistol her father had insisted she carry for emergencies. The weapon was a beautiful piece, ivory-handled and perfectly balanced, crafted by the finest gunsmiths in Austria. More importantly, Ophelia knew how to use it. Her father, despite his protective instincts, had been practical enough to ensure his daughter could defend herself if circumstances required it. "Stay back!" she commanded the approaching bandit leader, raising the pistol with steady hands. "I am quite capable of using this, I assure you." The bandit leader's horse reared slightly at the sight of the weapon, but his scarred face split into an ugly grin. "Put that toy away, little princess, before you hurt yourself. Fine ladies don't have the stomach for real violence." His mistake was assuming that aristocratic breeding meant weakness. Ophelia's emerald eyes hardened with determination as she sighted down the pistol's barrel. "You know nothing about fine ladies, sir, or about the lengths we will go to protect those who would protect us." She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out clearly through the forest, causing everyone, combatants and observers alike, to freeze momentarily. The bandit leader's expression shifted from amusement to shock as he looked down at his right shoulder, where Ophelia's bullet had found its mark with surgical precision. "Impossible," he gasped, swaying in his saddle. "You're just a woman who refuses to be underestimated," Ophelia finished coolly, already reloading with practiced efficiency. "Now withdraw, or the next shot will be considerably more permanent." The psychological effect of her intervention was immediate and devastating. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader wounded by a helpless aristocrat, began to lose the coordinated discipline that had made them dangerous. More importantly, Prince Maximilian seized the moment of distraction to press his advantage with renewed fury. "Magnificent!" he called out, his voice carrying genuine admiration as he cut down another opponent. "Lady Ashford, you have impeccable timing." The prince's renewed assault, combined with the shock of their leader's wounding, finally broke the bandits' morale completely. Those who could still fight began to fall back, while the wounded leader clutched his shoulder and glared at Ophelia with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. "This isn't over," he snarled through gritted teeth. "You may have won today, but there are powers at work here that neither of you understand." Maximilian's sword point found the man's throat with lightning speed. "Explain that cryptic statement, if you please. Who sent you to waylay Lady Ashford specifically?" The bandit leader's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, but not of the blade at his throat. "You think this was random highway robbery? You're more naive than I expected, Your Highness. The lady has enemies who want her taken alive, and they pay better than any ransom her family could provide." The revelation sent ice through both Ophelia and Maximilian. This had indeed been a targeted kidnapping, not a crime of opportunity, which meant the danger was far from over. "Who?" Maximilian demanded, pressing the sword point slightly deeper. "Who wants Lady Ashford and why?" But before the bandit leader could answer, or refuse to answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest. A full cavalry squadron was approaching at the gallop, their imperial uniforms gleaming in the sunlight as they burst into the clearing with military precision. "Your Highness," the squadron commander called out, surveying the scene of carnage with professional interest. "We heard gunfire and came immediately. Are you injured?" Maximilian stepped back from his captive, allowing the soldiers to take charge of the surviving bandits. "A scratch only, Colonel Brennan, but we have captured some interesting prisoners who may have valuable information about threats to imperial security." As the soldiers efficiently secured the bandits and tended to the wounded, Ophelia found herself alone with Prince Maximilian for the first time since his dramatic arrival. The adrenaline of combat was beginning to fade, leaving her acutely aware of what had just transpired. "Your Highness," she said formally, attempting to regain some semblance of aristocratic composure, "I am profoundly grateful for your intervention. Without your assistance, I fear—" "You fear nothing," Maximilian interrupted gently, his blue-grey eyes warm with admiration. "Lady Ashford, that was the finest display of courage under fire I have witnessed in many years of military service. You may have saved both our lives with that shot." The compliment sent warmth flooding through Ophelia's chest, but she forced herself to maintain proper decorum. "I merely did what circumstances required, Your Highness, as did you, though your actions went far beyond what any reasonable person would expect." Maximilian's smile was devastating in its charm. "Reasonable people rarely accomplish anything interesting, my lady. Besides, I could hardly allow harm to come to Austria's most beautiful and accomplished young woman." The casual reference to her beauty and accomplishments should have pleased Ophelia, but instead she found herself studying the prince's face more carefully. There was something in his expression that suggested his interest went beyond mere gallantry or imperial duty. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "you mentioned that you were traveling in this region on imperial business. Surely rescuing wayward travelers is not part of your official duties. Official duties can be flexible when circumstances warrant," Maximilian replied with a smile that suggested hidden depths. "But you raise an interesting point about my presence here. The truth is, Lady Ashford, I have been hoping for an opportunity to make your acquaintance for some time." The admission sent shockwaves through Ophelia's composure. "You have been hoping. Your reputation precedes you throughout the Empire," Maximilian explained, his tone growing more serious. "Not merely for your beauty, though that is certainly considerable, but for your intelligence, your charitable works, and your refreshing independence of spirit. Such qualities are rare in court circles." Ophelia felt her carefully maintained aristocratic reserve beginning to crumble under the intensity of his regard. "Your Highness surely exaggerates my modest accomplishments." "I never exaggerate, my lady. It is a luxury I cannot afford in my position." Maximilian moved closer, and Ophelia caught the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that seemed to cling to him. "The truth is that I have been seeking a way to request an introduction through proper channels, but court protocol moves slowly, and I confess to being an impatient man." The implications of his words were staggering. Prince Maximilian von Habsburg, one of the most eligible bachelors in Europe, was suggesting that he had been actively seeking her acquaintance. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "I see," Ophelia managed, though her voice was not quite steady. "And you believe that rescuing me from bandits constitutes a proper introduction?" Maximilian's laugh was rich with genuine humor. Perhaps not proper by Vienna's standards, but certainly memorable. Besides, shared danger has a way of revealing character more effectively than a dozen formal ballroom encounters. Before Ophelia could respond, Colonel Brennan approached with obvious reluctance to interrupt their conversation. "Your Highness, we have secured all the prisoners and are ready to escort you both to safety. However, we have also discovered some disturbing intelligence." "What sort of intelligence?" Maximilian asked, his demeanor shifting immediately back to military alertness. "The bandit leader carried documents suggesting this attack was indeed planned and funded by outside sources," Brennan reported grimly. "More troubling, there are indications that other attempts may be made to capture Lady Ashford before she reaches Prague." The news confirmed their worst fears about the targeted nature of the attack. Ophelia felt her newfound sense of safety evaporating as the full implications became clear. "Then we must ensure Lady Ashford reaches her destination with appropriate protection," Maximilian said decisively. "Colonel, I am commandeering your squadron for escort duty. Your Highness, with respect, your own mission for the Emperor can be delayed," Maximilian interrupted firmly. "Imperial business includes protecting imperial subjects, and Lady Ashford clearly requires our immediate attention." Ophelia found herself torn between gratitude for his protection and concern about the sacrifices he was making for her sake. "Your Highness, surely you need not abandon your own duties for my benefit. If your soldiers could simply escort me to the nearest garrison town—" "Lady Ashford," Maximilian said with quiet determination, "you have become my personal responsibility. I will see you safely to Prague myself, regardless of what other considerations that decision might involve." As the cavalry formed up around her carriage and preparations were made for the journey ahead, Ophelia realized that her life had just taken a dramatic turn that went far beyond mere rescue from highway bandits. Prince Maximilian's obvious interest in her, combined with the mysterious forces seeking to kidnap her, meant that she was stepping into a world of political intrigue and romantic possibility that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own future. The adventure was just beginning. The journey to Prague transformed from a simple family visit into something approaching a royal progress, with Prince Maximilian's cavalry squadron surrounding Ophelia's carriage in a formation that spoke of serious military concern rather than mere ceremonial protection. As they traveled through the increasingly mountainous terrain, the prince rode alongside her window, maintaining a steady conversation that revealed depths of intelligence and character she had not expected. "Your Highness," Ophelia said during one of their rest stops at a picturesque inn, "I confess myself curious about these mysterious enemies you believe I have acquired. I lead a rather quiet life dedicated to charitable works and family obligations. What could anyone possibly gain by kidnapping me?" Maximilian's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her question. They were seated in the inn's private dining room, sharing an excellent dinner while his soldiers maintained vigilant watch outside. The intimate setting had allowed their conversation to evolve beyond formal pleasantries into genuine intellectual exchange. "Lady Ashford," he said carefully, "your family's connections extend far beyond simple aristocratic bloodlines. Your father serves on the Imperial Council, your uncle commands the northern armies, and your cousin in Prague manages significant financial interests that affect imperial policy. Taking you hostage could provide leverage over several key figures in the Empire's leadership. The explanation made logical sense, but Ophelia sensed there was more to the story than political kidnapping. Yet you spoke earlier of hoping to make my acquaintance through proper channels. Surely your interest predates any concerns about my security. Maximilian's smile was rueful. Your perception is as keen as your reputation suggested it would be. You are correct. My interest in meeting you has nothing to do with political considerations and everything to do with personal ones. The admission sent warmth flooding through Ophelia's chest, though she struggled to maintain appropriate composure. Personal interest, Your Highness. I am 31 years old, Lady Ashford, and have spent my entire adult life in military service to the Empire. I have attended countless court functions, met hundreds of eligible young ladies, and found myself profoundly bored by virtually every encounter. Maximilian's voice grew more earnest as he continued. But your reputation suggested something different, a woman of substance rather than mere decoration. Ophelia found herself leaning forward, despite her attempts to maintain proper distance. And what exactly did my reputation suggest? That you refused 3 marriage proposals from perfectly suitable dukes because you found them intellectually insufficient, Maximilian replied with obvious admiration. That you established schools for working-class children against your father's initial objections. That you once publicly challenged a minister's interpretation of scripture during a formal debate, and won. Heat rose in Ophelia's cheeks at the catalogue of her supposed improprieties. Your Highness seems remarkably well informed about my private affairs. I make it my business to be informed about interesting people, Maximilian said simply, and you, Lady Ashford, are perhaps the most interesting woman in the Empire. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Brennan, whose expression carried urgency that immediately put both of them on alert. Your Highness, Brennan said quietly, we have received intelligence from our advance scouts. There is another group of armed men positioned along our planned route to Prague. They appear to be waiting for our arrival. Maximilian's demeanor shifted instantly from charming dinner companion to military commander. How many and what sort of weapons? At least 30 well-armed and positioned to control the main pass through the mountains. Professional soldiers by all appearances, not common bandits. The numbers were sobering. Even with his cavalry squadron, Maximilian would be facing a force of equal size that had chosen the ground and prepared defensive positions. The tactical advantage lay entirely with the enemy. Your Highness, Ophelia said quietly, perhaps it would be wiser to return to Vienna and request larger military escort. Surely whatever business awaits me in Prague is not worth risking so many lives. Maximilian's eyes flashed with something that might have been admiration for her concern for his soldiers' welfare. Lady Ashford, retreating would merely postpone the confrontation, not resolve it. These people, whoever they are, clearly have resources and determination that suggest they will not give up easily. He turned to Brennan with the crisp authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Colonel, what alternative routes are available? One, Your Highness, but it adds 2 days to our journey and requires passing through territory currently controlled by revolutionary militias. The rebels might prove as dangerous as whoever is waiting for us on the main road. Ophelia felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Good men were preparing to risk their lives because of threats directed at her, and she was powerless to protect them from the consequences of her mere existence. There is another option, she said slowly, an idea taking shape that both terrified and excited her. What if we were to approach their position under a flag of truce? If their goal is to capture me, rather than simply cause violence, perhaps we could negotiate. Absolutely not, Maximilian said immediately, his voice carrying the absolute authority of imperial command. Lady Ashford, I will not permit you to place yourself at their mercy in some misguided attempt at negotiation. But if it could prevent bloodshed, it could also result in your immediate capture and our complete defeat, Maximilian interrupted firmly. No, we will find another solution that does not require you to sacrifice yourself for our tactical convenience. The argument that followed revealed the fundamental tension between Ophelia's independent spirit and Maximilian's protective instincts. She was accustomed to making her own decisions and taking responsibility for their consequences, while he was bred to command and protect those under his care. Your Highness, Ophelia said with growing frustration, you speak of not permitting me to take risks, but I am not a child requiring your permission for my actions. If I choose to attempt negotiation, you choose nothing that places you in unnecessary danger, Maximilian replied with steel in his voice. I am responsible for your safety, and I will not allow misguided heroics to compromise that responsibility. Misguided heroics? Ophelia's emerald eyes flashed with anger. Your Highness, I rescued you from potential capture by shooting that bandit leader. I am not some helpless ornament requiring constant protection. You are a woman I care about, Maximilian said quietly, his admission cutting through her anger like a blade. And I will not watch you walk deliberately into danger, regardless of your courage or good intentions. The simple declaration, "A woman I care about," sent shockwaves through both of them. Maximilian had admitted to feelings that went far beyond mere political protection or casual gallantry, while Ophelia found herself confronting emotions she had been trying to ignore since his dramatic rescue. Your Highness, she said softly, her anger replaced by something far more complex. You speak of caring, but we have known each other for less than 2 days. Time means nothing when recognition is immediate, Maximilian replied with quiet conviction. I knew within minutes of meeting you that you were extraordinary. Every subsequent moment has only confirmed that initial impression. Ophelia felt her carefully maintained emotional barriers beginning to crumble. Even if that were true, circumstances make any such feelings too complicated. You are a prince of the empire, while I am merely... You are merely the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered, Maximilian interrupted. Your birth is noble, your character is extraordinary, and your intelligence surpasses that of most men I know. What complications could possibly override such obvious compatibility? The conversation was moving into territory that both thrilled and terrified Ophelia. Prince Maximilian was suggesting feelings and possibilities that she had never dared imagine, but accepting them would mean stepping into a world of political complexity and social scrutiny that could destroy them both. Your Highness, she said carefully, even if mutual regard exists between us, the practical obstacles remain formidable. A prince's marriage choices affect imperial policy, diplomatic alliances, and political stability. Surely you cannot simply follow personal preference in such matters. Maximilian's smile was both sad and determined. Ophelia, may I call you Ophelia? You underestimate both my position within the imperial family and my willingness to fight for what I want. I am not the heir to the throne, which grants me considerable freedom in personal choices, and I am prepared to use every resource at my disposal to overcome whatever obstacles might stand between us. The use of her given name sent electricity through Ophelia's entire being. The formal barriers between them were dissolving, replaced by something far more intimate and dangerous. But first, Maximilian continued, his tone returning to military crispness, we must deal with the immediate threat to your safety. Colonel Brennan, prepare the men for night movement. We will attempt to outflank their position under cover of darkness. As the inn settled into evening quiet and preparations began for what would undoubtedly be a dangerous night march, Ophelia found herself facing a choice that would determine the entire course of her future. Prince Maximilian had declared his feelings and his intentions with a directness that both honored and overwhelmed her. But accepting his courtship would mean entering a world where every decision carried political consequences, where personal happiness would always be balanced against imperial necessity. Was she prepared for such a life, and was he truly willing to risk everything for a love that had blossomed in the space of 2 extraordinary days? The revolution in her heart was complete, but the most dangerous challenges still lay ahead. Under cover of complete darkness, Prince Maximilian's cavalry moved like ghosts through the mountain forests, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and their weapons blackened to prevent any glint of moonlight from betraying their position. Ophelia rode in the center of the formation, her dark traveling cloak pulled close around her, every sense heightened by the tension of their desperate gambit. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: circle around the ambush position during the night, strike at dawn when the enemy would least expect attack, and break through to Prague before additional forces could be summoned. But as they navigated the treacherous mountain paths by starlight, Ophelia could feel the weight of impending crisis settling over them like a suffocating blanket. "My lady," Margaret whispered from beside her in the modified carriage that had been lightened for silent travel, "perhaps we should have remained at the inn and sent for help from Vienna, and allow these mysterious enemies to regroup and plan an even more devastating attack?" Ophelia replied quietly. "No, Margaret. Sometimes courage requires moving forward into uncertainty rather than retreating into false safety." Through the darkness, she could see Prince Maximilian's silhouette as he rode point with the advanced scouts. his bearing alert and confident despite the enormous risks they were taking. Watching him command his troops with quiet efficiency, she felt a surge of admiration that went far beyond mere attraction. This was leadership in its purest form, a man willing to place himself at maximum danger to protect those under his care. Colonel Brennan appeared beside her carriage like a shadow, his voice barely above a breath as he reported their progress. "My lady, we have successfully bypassed their outer sentries and should reach the flanking position within the hour. However, our scouts report that the enemy force is larger than initially estimated, perhaps 40 men rather than 30. The news was sobering. Even with the advantage of surprise, Maximilian's 20 cavalrymen would be engaging a force nearly twice their size. The mathematics of combat were unforgiving, and valor could not overcome such overwhelming numerical disadvantage indefinitely. "Colonel," Ophelia said quietly, "what are our chances of breaking through their position successfully?" Brennan's hesitation spoke volumes. "Your Highness has asked me to be honest with you, my lady. Our chances are modest. Much will depend on how quickly we can create chaos in their ranks, and whether their discipline holds under unexpected pressure." As they continued their silent approach through the pine-scented darkness, Ophelia found herself wrestling with a decision that could save lives or doom them all. The enemy's goal was clearly her capture rather than general violence. She was the prize they sought, and they had invested considerable resources in obtaining her. What if she could use that fact to their tactical advantage? When they reached the final staging area before the assault, Prince Maximilian appeared at her carriage window like a materialization of aristocratic determination. Even in the darkness, she could see the controlled tension in his posture as he prepared for what might be their final conversation. "Ophelia," he said softly, using her given name with an intimacy that made her heart race, "in a few minutes we will discover whether fortune favors our desperate enterprise. Before we commit to battle, I want you to know—" "What?" she prompted when he hesitated. "That these past 2 days have been the most remarkable of my life," Maximilian continued with quiet intensity. "Meeting you, seeing your courage and intelligence, imagining the future we might build together, it has changed everything about how I view my own existence." The confession was both beautiful and heartbreaking, given the circumstances under which it was delivered. "Maximilian," Ophelia replied, using his name for the first time, "if we survive this night, I want you to know that the feelings you have described are entirely mutual. You have shown me what true partnership might mean between a man and woman of equal spirit." Their hands found each other through the carriage window, and for a moment, the looming battle faded into insignificance beside the power of their connection. But the spell was broken by Colonel Brennan's urgent whisper. "Your Highness, the men are in position. We await your signal to commence the attack." Maximilian squeezed Ophelia's hand once more, then released it as he transformed back into the military commander upon whom 20 lives depended. "Very well, Colonel. Signal the charge in 3 minutes. Remember, speed and aggression are our only advantages." As Maximilian prepared to lead his men into battle, Ophelia made her decision. She could not sit passively while good men died for her sake when she possessed the power to potentially end the conflict without bloodshed. "Maximilian, wait," she called softly. When he turned back, she spoke quickly before he could interrupt. "What if I were to approach their lines under a flag of truce and offer myself in exchange for safe passage for your soldiers? Their goal is my capture. Perhaps they would accept a negotiated surrender rather than risk the losses that battle would bring." Maximilian's expression went absolutely rigid with controlled fury. "Ophelia, we have already discussed this option, and I rejected it categorically. You will not sacrifice yourself in some misguided attempt to spare us the consequences of doing our duty. But if it could save lives, it could also result in your immediate capture and torture while we are left powerless to help you," Maximilian interrupted with steel in his voice. "No. The answer is no, now and always." But even as they argued in urgent whispers, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Someone was riding hard toward their position, and secrecy was no longer possible. "Enemy patrol," Colonel Brennan hissed. "They've discovered our flanking movement." The tactical situation collapsed in an instant. Their carefully planned surprise attack had become a desperate fighting retreat, with discovery eliminating any hope of strategic advantage. Worse, the sound of signal horns in the distance indicated that the main enemy force was being alerted to their presence. "New plan," Maximilian said, with the calm decisiveness of a born commander. "Fighting withdrawal to the secondary position, protect Lady Ashford at all costs. But as his cavalry formed defensive positions around Ophelia's carriage, the sound of approaching riders grew steadily louder. They were about to be engaged by superior numbers in darkness that would eliminate their advantages, while magnifying the enemies. It was then that Ophelia made the decision that would haunt and define the rest of her life. As the first enemy riders burst into view and the clash of steel began to ring through the forest, she slipped quietly from her carriage and began moving through the shadows toward the heart of the battle. If the enemy wanted her badly enough to risk war with the Imperial cavalry, then her presence on the battlefield might be enough to end the fighting before it escalated into a massacre. She would not allow Maximilian and his brave soldiers to die, protecting a prize that she could deliver herself. Moving with the stealth that her unconventional education had taught her, Ophelia approached the swirling melee, where Prince Maximilian's sword was already weaving patterns of silver death among his enemies. The sight of him fighting with desperate fury to protect her filled her heart with love and terror in equal measure. "I am here," she called out in clear, carrying voice that cut through the sounds of combat. "Lady Ophelia Ashford, I surrender myself voluntarily in exchange for the withdrawal of all forces." The effect was immediate and electric. Combat ceased as if by magic, with every fighter turning to stare at the elegantly dressed young woman who had appeared like an avenging angel in the midst of their battle. Enemy soldiers who had been pressing their attack suddenly found themselves uncertain of their orders when their primary objective had just offered itself freely. "Ophelia, no!" Maximilian's voice carried anguish and fury as he realized what she had done. "Fall back immediately!" But it was too late. A circle of enemy soldiers was already forming around her position. Their leader, a professional soldier whose bearing spoke of significant military experience, approaching with a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. "Lady Ashford," the enemy commander said with formal courtesy, "I am Colonel Vasquez and I am authorized to accept your surrender on behalf of my employers. If you will accompany us peacefully, no harm will come to you or to Prince Maximilian's forces." "And if I refuse?" Ophelia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then this forest will become a slaughterhouse, and you will accompany us anyway, after watching everyone you care about die for your stubborn pride." The choice was no choice at all, and everyone present understood the mathematics of the situation. Ophelia looked across the clearing to where Maximilian sat his horse, with fury and desperation warring in his expression, knowing that she was about to break both their hearts in the service of saving his life. "Very well, Colonel Vasquez," she said with all the dignity she could muster. "I accept your terms." The fortress of Karlstein loomed against the dawn sky like something from a medieval nightmare, its ancient towers and battlements speaking of centuries of warfare and political intrigue. Deep within its dungeons, Ophelia sat in a cell that was surprisingly comfortable for a prison, though the iron bars and armed guards left no doubt about her status as a captive. 3 days had passed since her surrender in the forest, and she had learned much about her captors during that time. Colonel Vasquez, despite his role in her kidnapping, had proven to be a gentleman who ensured her comfort and safety while maintaining absolute security. More importantly, he had been surprisingly forthcoming about the forces behind her abduction. "Lady Ashford," he said during one of his daily visits, "I hope you understand that your treatment reflects no personal animosity on my part. You have conducted yourself with remarkable dignity under circumstances that would challenge anyone's composure." "Thank you, Colonel," Ophelia replied from her position by the window, where she could see the road leading to Prague in the distance. "Though I confess myself still puzzled about who has invested such resources in my capture and why." Vasquez's expression grew troubled. "The truth is more complex than simple political kidnapping, my lady. Your abduction was commissioned by a consortium of individuals who believe your influence over certain key figures in the imperial government could be redirected to serve their interests." The explanation confirmed what Ophelia had begun to suspect. Her kidnapping was not random criminal enterprise, but a carefully orchestrated political maneuver designed to leverage her family connections for some larger purpose. "What sort of interests?" she asked directly. "The kind that prosper during periods of political instability," Vasquez admitted reluctantly. "There are those who profit from conflict between the imperial government and the revolutionary movements, and they view your family's influence as an obstacle to their plans." Before Ophelia could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the courtyard below. She moved to the window and felt her heart leap with joy and terror as she recognized the imperial banners flying at the head of a substantial military column. Prince Maximilian had come for her. "Colonel," she said urgently, "you must surrender this fortress immediately. Prince Maximilian commands significant forces, and he will not negotiate for my release." Vasquez joined her at the window, his expression grim as he assessed the imperial forces deploying around the fortress. "Your prince is either very brave or very foolish, my lady. This fortress has never been taken by direct assault, and my employers have provided me with resources adequate to withstand a considerable siege." "You don't understand," Ophelia said with absolute conviction. "Maximilian will not accept my captivity regardless of the cost. He will tear this fortress apart stone by stone if necessary." As if summoned by her words, the prince's voice echoed across the courtyard, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying the absolute authority of imperial command. "Colonel Vasquez, I am Prince Maximilian von Habsburg, acting under direct authority of His Imperial Majesty. You are holding an imperial subject unlawfully, and I demand her immediate release." Vasquez moved to the window and called back, "Your Highness, Lady Ashford is safe and well treated. However, her release must be negotiated through proper diplomatic channels rather than military intimidation." "There will be no negotiations," Maximilian's voice replied, with steel-cold finality. "You have 1 hour to release Lady Ashford unharmed and surrender yourself for judgment. After that time, I will consider you enemies of the Empire and act accordingly." The ultimatum sent chills through everyone in the fortress. Prince Maximilian was offering no middle ground, no face-saving compromise that might allow for peaceful resolution. It was complete surrender or total war. "Colonel," Ophelia said quietly, "Maximilian means exactly what he says. If you do not surrender, he will attack this fortress with everything he has regardless of the casualties that might result. And if I do surrender, my lady, I will face charges of treason that carry a death sentence," Vasquez replied grimly. "My choice appears to be between certain death and possible victory." But as they spoke, new sounds echoed from the courtyard, not the preparation for siege, but the arrival of additional forces flying different banners. Ophelia pressed closer to the window and gasped as she recognized the imperial eagle of the Emperor's personal guard. "Colonel," she breathed, "those are not ordinary cavalry units. Prince Maximilian has brought the Emperor's own elite forces. This is no longer a rescue mission. It is an imperial military operation." The implications were staggering. By involving the Emperor's personal troops, Maximilian had escalated her rescue into a matter of imperial prestige that could not be allowed to fail. The political consequences of backing down now would be catastrophic for everyone involved. A new voice joined the shouted exchanges, older, more authoritative, carrying the weight of absolute power. "Colonel Vasquez, this is Field Marshal von Radetzky commanding in His Imperial Majesty's name. Surrender immediately, or face the full consequences of rebellion against the crown." Vasquez's face went pale at the mention of the legendary military commander whose victories had secured the Empire's borders for decades. "Dear God," he whispered, "they've mobilized the entire imperial war machine for your rescue." "Because," Ophelia said softly, understanding flooding through her, "Maximilian has made my safety a matter of personal honor that reflects on the imperial family itself. He cannot allow me to remain captive without appearing weak before every enemy of the Empire." The political chess game had escalated beyond anyone's original intentions. What had begun as a criminal kidnapping had become a test of imperial authority that would resonate throughout Europe. Below in the courtyard, Maximilian appeared in person, resplendent in his dress uniform and accompanied by a staff that included some of the Empire's most senior military commanders. Even at a distance, Ophelia could see the controlled fury in his bearing as he prepared for what would be either her rescue or their mutual destruction. "One final opportunity," his voice carried clearly to every corner of the fortress. "Surrender Lady Ashford now and face military justice. Continue this rebellion and face the consequences of treason against the crown." Colonel Vasquez looked at Ophelia with an expression that was equal parts resignation and admiration. "Your prince truly loves you, my lady. Few men would risk war for a woman, regardless of their feelings." "And I love him," Ophelia replied simply, "which is why I cannot allow him to destroy himself for my sake." Before Vasquez could stop her, Ophelia had moved to the window and called out across the courtyard, "Maximilian, I am unharmed and well treated. Do not risk your men's lives for my sake." The prince's response was immediate and absolute. "Ophelia, your safety is worth any risk. Hold fast, You will be free within the hour." The declaration carried such conviction that even Vasquez seemed affected by it. "Your Highness," he called back, "perhaps we might discuss terms that would avoid unnecessary bloodshed." But before Maximilian could respond, explosions rocked the fortress as Imperial artillery opened fire on the outer walls. The siege had begun in earnest, with the Empire's finest military minds applying overwhelming force to resolve the crisis as quickly as possible. "It appears," Vasquez said with grim humor, "that your prince prefers military solutions to diplomatic ones." "Very well, my lady. I cannot fight the entire Imperial army for the sake of employers who clearly underestimated the consequences of their scheme." He moved to the window and raised a white flag, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "Prince Maximilian, I surrender this fortress and place myself at your mercy. Lady Ashford will be delivered to you immediately." The artillery fell silent, as if by magic, and within minutes the fortress gates were opening to admit Imperial troops, led by Prince Maximilian himself. Ophelia heard his boots on the stone stairs, heard his voice demanding her location, and suddenly he was there, filling the doorway of her cell like an avenging angel in Imperial blue and gold. "Ophelia," he said, and her name was a prayer of thanksgiving on his lips. "Maximilian," she replied, and then she was in his arms, safe and whole, and surrounded by love so powerful it seemed to illuminate the ancient stone walls around them. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands gentle as they checked for injuries, while his eyes blazed with barely controlled emotion. "Did they harm you in any way?" "They treated me with complete courtesy," Ophelia assured him, though tears of relief were streaming down her face. "But Maximilian, you risked everything for my sake. If this rescue had failed, then I would have failed with it," he said simply. "Ophelia, these past 3 days have taught me something vital about the nature of love. I would rather die attempting to protect you than live safely without you." As they emerged from the fortress into the morning sunlight, surrounded by cheering Imperial troops and under the proud gaze of Austria's finest military commanders, Ophelia realized that their love story had become something far greater than personal romance. It had become a legend of devotion that would inspire poets and storytellers for generations to come. "Now," Maximilian said, as he lifted her onto his horse for the ride to safety, "we have a wedding to plan. Assuming, of course, that you will accept a proposal from a prince foolish enough to mobilize half the Imperial army for a rescue mission." Ophelia's laughter rang out across the Bohemian countryside like music. "Your Highness, I thought you would never ask." 2 years later, the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace bloomed in all their imperial magnificence, hosting what the Vienna newspapers declared to be the most romantic anniversary celebration in living memory. Prince Maximilian and Princess Ophelia von Habsburg walked hand in hand through pathways lined with roses and jasmine, their obvious happiness casting a golden glow over everything they touched. The transformation in both their lives had been remarkable to witness. Maximilian, once known primarily for his military prowess and bachelor status, had evolved into one of the Empire's most effective diplomatic voices, using his marriage to bridge the gap between aristocratic privilege and popular sentiment. His rescue of Ophelia had become the stuff of legend, inspiring everything from opera compositions to heroic paintings that adorned galleries throughout Europe. Ophelia herself had exceeded every expectation of what a princess might accomplish. Rather than retreating into the comfortable obscurity of court life, she had used her position to advance causes that had always been close to her heart. Her schools for working-class children had expanded into a comprehensive educational reform movement, while her charitable foundations had become models of efficiency and compassion throughout the empire. "Your Highness," said Count Metternich as they paused by the palace's famous Neptune fountain, "the Emperor wished me to convey his satisfaction with the intelligence reports from Bohemia. The criminal organization behind your wife's kidnapping has been completely dismantled." Maximilian's expression grew serious at mention of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed their happiness. The investigation following Colonel Vasquez's surrender had revealed a web of political corruption and financial manipulation that reached into the highest levels of European society. "And Vasquez himself?" Ophelia inquired. She had never forgotten the courtesy the man had shown her during her captivity, even while holding her prisoner. "Has proven surprisingly cooperative in providing evidence against his former employers," Metternich replied with approval. "His sentence has been commuted to military service on the Italian frontier." The Emperor felt that a man capable of honor, even while serving dishonorable masters, deserved a chance at redemption. As Metternich departed to attend to other imperial business, Maximilian and Ophelia continued their walk through gardens that had become a sanctuary from the pressures of public life. Despite their elevated position, they had managed to maintain the intimate connection that had first bloomed during those dangerous days on the road to Prague. "Do you ever regret it?" Maximilian asked as they settled on a marble bench overlooking the palace's ornamental lake. "The loss of privacy, the constant scrutiny, the weight of representing the imperial family in everything you do." Ophelia smiled, her emerald eyes bright with contentment. "How could I regret a life that has exceeded every dream I ever dared harbor? Besides," she added, with the spirit that had first captured his heart, "I have discovered that one can accomplish remarkable things when one has the resources of an empire at one's disposal." Indeed, Princess Ophelia's initiatives had transformed her from mere aristocratic ornament into a genuine force for social progress. Her educational programs were being studied and replicated throughout Europe, while her advocacy for women's rights had begun to influence policy discussions at the highest levels of government. "Speaking of accomplishments," Maximilian said, his voice taking on a tone of barely contained excitement, "I have something to tell you that may interest you considerably." Ophelia turned to face him fully, noting the particular expression he wore when he had managed some especially clever political maneuver. "I have just received confirmation that your proposal for imperial universities open to qualified students regardless of birth or wealth has been approved by the Emperor's Council," Maximilian announced with obvious pride. "Funding will begin next year, with the first institutions scheduled to open in Vienna, Prague, and Budapest." Ophelia stared at him in shock, then threw her arms around his neck with such enthusiasm that several passing courtiers smiled at the display of obvious affection. "Maximilian, that represents everything I have been working toward. How did you manage to convince the council?" "By pointing out that an empire's strength lies in the abilities of all its citizens, not merely those fortunate enough to be born into privilege," Maximilian replied, his voice warm with shared triumph. "Also by mentioning that my wife would make my life considerably uncomfortable if her educational reforms were not implemented with appropriate speed." Their laughter rang across the palace gardens, a sound of pure joy that seemed to embody everything hopeful about their partnership and their future together. "Your Highness," came a familiar voice, as Margaret appeared with the careful timing that marked an experienced lady's maid. "Forgive the interruption, but you have visitors waiting in the blue drawing room." Ophelia raised an eyebrow in inquiry. They had not been expecting anyone, and their private time together was carefully guarded against unexpected intrusions. "Lord and Lady Ashford," Margaret explained with a slight smile. "Your parents arriving unannounced from England with what they describe as urgent family business." Maximilian and Ophelia exchanged glances that carried 2 years' worth of shared understanding. Ophelia's parents had initially been overwhelmed by their daughter's elevation to imperial rank, but had gradually adapted to their new status as members of the extended imperial family. Urgent family business from them could mean anything from political crisis to simple desire to visit their daughter. "We should go," Ophelia said, rising from the bench with the fluid grace that had become second nature during her years as a princess, "though I confess to curiosity about what could bring them to Vienna without advance notice." As they made their way through the palace corridors that had become as familiar to Ophelia as her childhood home, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a kidnapping victim, rescued by a prince she barely knew. Now she was an imperial princess whose voice carried weight in council chambers and whose initiatives were reshaping imperial policy. But more than the external transformations, it was the depth of love she had found with Maximilian that made everything else possible. Their partnership had proven that even in a world defined by rigid protocol and political necessity, genuine affection and mutual respect could create something powerful enough to change the world around them. "Whatever my parents want to discuss," Ophelia said as they approached the blue drawing room, "I hope it won't require extended travel. I have grown quite fond of our quiet evenings and morning walks in the garden." "As have I," Maximilian agreed, pausing to steal a quick kiss before they entered the formal setting where public persona would be required. "Though I suspect that quiet domesticity is a luxury we will always have to fight to protect." They entered the drawing room to find Ophelia's parents in animated conversation with several other guests, whose presence immediately explained the urgent family business. Her cousin James from Prague, Her uncle, the general, and several other family members had gathered for what appeared to be an impromptu reunion. "Ophelia!" her mother exclaimed, rising with obvious delight to embrace her daughter. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear. Marriage to His Highness clearly agrees with you." "Indeed it does," Ophelia replied warmly, accepting embraces from the assembled family members, while Maximilian greeted them with the perfect courtesy that made him beloved among his in-laws. "But we have not come merely for social visiting," her father announced with the serious expression that meant significant news. "We bring word of developments that may interest their highnesses considerably." "What sort of developments?" Maximilian asked, his diplomatic instincts immediately alert to potential complications. "The kind that suggest your rescue of Ophelia and subsequent investigation of her kidnapping has had far-reaching consequences," James explained with obvious excitement. "The criminal network you helped expose has led to revelations of corruption that are forcing government reforms throughout Central Europe. Your love story, it seems, has become accidentally political." Ophelia and Maximilian exchanged another of their meaningful glances. Their personal happiness had indeed become entangled with historical forces beyond their control, but perhaps that was as it should be for people in their position. "Then we shall meet whatever challenges arise as we always have," Maximilian said firmly, taking Ophelia's hand in a gesture that was both protective and partnership. "Together, with love and determination as our guides." As evening settled over Vienna, and the palace gardens filled with the soft glow of lamplight, the von Habsburg family gathered around their drawing-room table to discuss the future they would build together. Outside the windows, the empire stretched away into the night, full of promise and possibility for those brave enough to seize them. The prince who had ridden to rescue a lady from bandits with only one sword had discovered that love, properly applied, was a weapon more powerful than any blade. And the lady who had surrendered herself to save her rescuer had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came through apparent sacrifice. Their legend would grow with each telling, inspiring future generations to believe that true love could indeed conquer any obstacle, overcome any enemy, and transform even the most impossible circumstances into triumph. The revolution in their hearts had become a revolution in their world, and the best was yet to come. If you want more stories like this video and subscribe to support the channel.